Tony with a Y was a violent guy with a borderline personality disorder. Then one day Tony left town without word, and I cannot lie and say it was not a relief to be left behind. A couple of years went by, and all of a sudden a familiar face arrived in the town. It was Toni, with an I. It seemed Tony had found himself. No longer a he, him, but a she, shim, and for a brief time I was relieved, thinking maybe his violent, standoffish disposition was all thanks to the repression of his feminine side, and now, upon her return, Toni with an I, post-transition, would demonstrate her newfound contentedness, self-awareness, self-acceptance, confidence, and realigned, well-directed ambition by way of conducting a more socially aware, less narcissistic form of conversation. Hindsight can really highlight how pie in the sky an expectation could be. You see, Toni with a Y had had a bright idea one night. He was contemplating how he could possibly remain a violent narcissistic type and still fly under the radar in plain sight. And thus returning with all her might, Toni with an I stepped in to the spotlight. Using the thin veneer of trans rights to hide aggressive tendencies that might, with little prodding, turn to physical altercation on the border of life-threatening. This is no exaggeration. Toni took to carrying a baseball bat around the city with her, slung over the right shoulder, tense and ready. Finger on the holster. If you told her it was too much, you were attacking a gender. It was now an issue of politics, an assault on her rights, not a thing to do with threatening behaviour disguised with the very real plight of sexual and gender identification. And oh, how the people applauded as she barreled, guns blazing, down the street. Invincible, Toni was untouchable, protected by the fear of the public, who could not dare to question an LGBTQIA+ member's motives for fear of social repercussion. This wolf in sheep's clothing exploited the social loophole of blind tolerance. Full exoneration, get out of jail free card. Next stop, beat a man to death for looking out of the wrong way station. A case-by-case basis for judgment on these situations is needed, because generalization works both ways. Just like sexuality, just like gender. And contrary to what their modern legal system will have us believe, morality is a spectrum. It's not just black and white, right or wrong, gay or straight, pants or thong. And if we're not willing to talk about this shit, then there will always be somebody standing by, ready and willing to jump in and exploit it, using differences in political ideology as an excuse to excuse themselves of all behavioural responsibility. This isn't new. It's a new face for the old, tried and true, fascist-like enforcement of a political point of view. There is always two sides to any story you've been sold, no matter how convincing or supposedly moralistic one side may be. There is a reason why gender identity politics is more widely discussed amongst the more middle-class areas of society. And it's not just, because it may not appeal to the more openly discriminatory mentality that can accompany those in the working class. Note, I said more openly discriminatory, because discrimination prevails any class system, underhandedly or openly. But it's also thanks to the language accompanying the politics of gender and sexual identity being hijacked and used as a token Trojan horse, doubling as a conversational battering ram so as to enforce the willful individual agenda of self-righteousness and persecution. And then there's still any wonder why division still pervades this issue. The enforcing of acceptance is an oxymoron. If we are only accepting of those who agree with our perspective, obviously, this is not true acceptance. If politics is not an open conversation, if no one is willing to adopt, however briefly, the opposition's perspective, recognising, however difficult it may be to believe, that the people out there spouting homophobia and bigotry, unfortunately, are human beings. And yeah, actually, they do have a right to express their opinion just like we do. Then we will never truly be free. We certainly wouldn't be in a democracy, and we wouldn't want to come across as an atomising dictatorship masquerading as a democracy now, would we? So don't demonise, empathise, and change their mind from the other side. Don't wrap a person up in red tape until they no longer appear human, because it's easier to disregard a person's opinion when we can think of them as monsters. Yeah? A lost and confused soul would require real consideration, and that's far too demanding of our time and attention. Rigidity, inflexibility, stubborn refusal to meet halfway, these things will guarantee that phonies like Toni repeatedly exploit the holes in the system existing to keep opposition at bay. Even dickheads like Toni deserve a say. But that is not to say that he should put on a dress only so he can use it to socially baptize all his transgressions away. No matter how Toni chooses to identify, I or Y, this is unimportant when it comes to the social and legal ramifications of an individual's behaviour. One should not preclude the other. Toni needs help. Don't just stand there gormless and give Toni a medal. Toni is fucking mental. And it's all getting that way. It is time to partially dismantle, loosen the screws, reassess, reevaluate, compromise. We haven't finished the discussion. We haven't reached the pinnacle. There will always be a need for continuation of conversations like these, so long as there is class division and therefore opportunity and disadvantage. Because of course these are going to play a role in our political preferences. Our politics has become so polarised. Up, down, right, wrong, left, right. Yes, no. That we appear to have arrived at a point where if we can't make up a decision at all, because of course we have to make up a decision and stick with it, right? That if all discussion fails, we can simply resort to Old Faithful to curtail our moral and political conundrum. Heads or tails? Well, I'm sorry, but life just... it isn't that simple.